Hello everyone. I've been struggling under this terrible Keatsian bad throat, so if you don't, I've got a very romantic illness at the moment, so if you don't mind me drinking water. This story is one of the wellsprings of the book that I was fortunate to be commissioned to write, but also unfortunate in the fact that the publisher gave me an open-ended deadline, nothing, and so I've been doing nothing for ages, and but luckily things have taken off, and I've got an artist who's a friend of mine. He's quite a prominent artist, and he's going to paint all of the stories, and so he's given me a deadline, so I have to keep producing the stories. But this story was one of the wellsprings. It was first snatches of it were first told to me when I was really young. And as a relative, I never quite understood what his association was with my grandfather, but his name was Forker O'Brien. So you can imagine how, when I grew older, how I used to play with that name. But anyway, Forker told me bits of this, and then I came across the Browning version and other versions. And there's nothing like trying to put a story on and make it your own. And so this is what I did, and this was the first one that I wrote when I came to assemble or kind of write the book. And so I'll talk more about it afterwards, because I want to just, well, apart from the fact that it's this quizzical, gnomic, riddling kind of aspect of the story, that kind of has always intrigued me. And I kind of don't know myself. Certain aspects of that story are kind of very odd. And just before then, someone told me a story a few years ago which kind of reminded me of the Child Rowland story, or this aspect of liminality which is in the story, about an old woman who bought a new bucket at a market, and she took it home, and she was using it to milk her goats, and then she'd wash it up and then put it out of the back door, and then a voice came in the night saying, "Mrs, can we have a borrow of your bucket, your new bucket?" And she said, of course, because she knew it was the good people who lived in the hill at the end of her garden. And so she said, of course, but I want it back the next morning. And so, sure enough, when she opened the door the next morning, there was the bucket all washed and clean for her. And then the next night, a little voice said to her, "Mrs, can we have a loan of your bucket?" And she said, "Yes, but I want it back the next morning." And she opened the door, and there it was. And a voice said the next night, "Can we have a loan of your bucket?" It's always threes, isn't it? And she said, "Yes, but I want it back the next morning." And it wasn't there the next morning. So she walked along to the end of her garden, to this little fairy hill that was the end of her garden. But as she was walking towards this little hill, a voice says, "Who's that woman walking towards us?" And the other voice in the hill said, "It's that woman from the land of the dead who wants her bucket back." And I was just thinking, whoever thought of that story? Whoever thought of that? That's mad. Kind of quantum. It's so weird that we are dead to them as they may be to us. Anyway, so I'll read the Child Rowland story. You must first pass the sentry geese. How they clack and hiss on the quilt of green meadow that slants up to Coombs Church. The tapsel gate spins on a central pivot, so that when you enter the graveyard, its other half opens to the world and closes back on your heels in a completed curve. From the trees come only rusty crow chatter. The Saxons like their chapels to be intimate, and Coombs is suitably tiny, so it takes no more than 30 seconds to trail your fingers all along the sides of the slick flint walls. You are back at the porch before there's time to think. Would that it had been this way for Bird Ellen all those years ago. Daffodil yellow laughter in a green meadow. A boy and a girl are playing at ball, and duff is the sound it makes when it's kicked. Bird Ellen is older than Rowland. They both have chestnut hair, but she is tall, and her shadow licks long across the grass. They would call the boy Rowland a kiddie here in Sussex, meaning not that he's a child, but instead that he has yet to go out into his wide future. His sister, too, is nearly a woman. Duff! The ball pitches down to Rowland. He laughs in the May morning, and he kicks it high, high. Over his sister's head it flies, over the tapsel gate, and then high, high into the blue above the church roof. Bird Ellen yars him for an oath and hitches up her skirts. She runs up to the gate. Her shadow reaches the rails before she does. Then she is through the gate with her long hair streaming as she runs to the back of the church. Rowland waits, but Ellen does not reappear. After a minute he calls her name, then he calls it again. Nothing. Just the elms creaking and the wind soughing. Nothing. Then he too pushes the gate, which spins and nearly catches the back of his legs. He runs past the porch and into the shadow on the north side and sees nothing. Nothing, save long grass parting in the wind and white irises, and beyond the graveyard bare downland where the sheep graze. She is gone, snapped out of the day completely. Then it comes to him, widdershins. She ran the wrong way against the course of the sun, widdershins. He wheels about and calls her name, although he knows she is not there. He bolts away from the church across the downs. An hour later he is bent double with wheezing. He is on top of the giant hill that was a fort before the Romans came. The sea is distant to his back. The wind blusters loud. He looks across the hills to a coven of trees hunching on the horizon, and smoke wavers above the trees. Merlin's hut is wattles and slubbed clay. Smoke seeps from chinks and cracks in the walls and out of the door. Smoke fumbles up to a mossy hole in the roof. Merlin lives alone on top of Chanctonbury. People leave him be, but Rowland once brought him mushrooms. He is not afraid of the old man for all his odd blether and scratching. Widdershins, Merlin coughs. Between his fingers he rubs thyme and lovage into a boiling pot. By Keronos and Eron, why? Grave Merlin, with his twig-threaded beard, his bare ankles and flapping cloak. His eyes seem to spin crazy when Rowland looks into them like mackerel lures paid out into the past. Old eyes, winter eyes. Has Adshead made a sign on your brow? Merlin's accent is strange, not from here. What? The Adshead, the priest. Merlin sputters with irritation. Did the priest bless you when you were a baby? Yes, we were all christened. Rowland can hardly breathe for the smoke in the hut. Widdershins, your mother often told you, and your father too before they died, told you not to run widdershins round the church. Merlin's voice is all up and down. She's been stolen, taken by the king of Elfland into his dark tower. Where, Rowland asks, is this dark tower? Far away. How are we to rescue her? Rowland's eyes stream with smoke and anguish. Christendom. Merlin's accent is like a crust of snow breaking, like a cough before a song. What? Only the boldest knight in Christendom can rescue your sister, Bird Ellen. Ham is Rowland's hot-headed eldest brother. He backhands the boy across the room, where he falls in a clatter of pewter and treen bowls. In his rage, he calls Rowland every name he can think of for not taking care of their only sister. Just as Ham is unbuckling his belt to give Rowland another lash, Elfred, the next oldest, steps between them. Peace, Ham, peace. Peace, shouts Ham. His mouth is like a red forge. His temples are crimson. I must away to the dark tower to find our Bird Ellen. Make sure the boy does not lead you two into peril. Ham grabs a blackthorn stick and walks to the door. Boldest knight in Christendom. Bah! He gives Rowland a furnace look and is gone. They wait. All through the summer they look to the chalk path that Ham trod into the woods. He never returns. When the harvest is in and the cattle are in the winter byre, Elfred begins to grow restless. Elfred, the handsome one, whose name indeed means elf-kissed. One day Rowland finds his brother stuffing bread and cheese into a bag. Elfred hoists the bag over his shoulder. I'm off to find Ellen and Ham. I do not know if I'm the boldest knight in Christendom, but I must try to rescue them. Fair and gainly, Elfred walks the chalk path into the woods over the hill. He doesn't return. Rowland stands on the springy downland grass outside Merlin's door. Jaya and Jaya, the old man laughs. I've stepped into your story. Come along inside. Rowland sits on the bare earth floor, his chin resting on his knees. The wizard faces him from the other side of his crackling fire. How do I get to the Dark Tower, he asks. Any direction will take you to Elfland, but you may as well walk the path your brothers took. You said it was far away. How far? Very far. How will I know the place when I see it? You'll know when you draw near to the Dark Tower. Merlin stirs his bubbling pot. Well, I must go. He rises, but Merlin stretches his arm fast and grips Rowland's wrist in his long, tight fingers. Wait, there is more. Merlin's grey eyes fix him. What more? Only the boldest knight in Christendom can. I know that. Well, if you make it to the realm of the King of Elfland, you must eat nothing and drink nothing. When you're in his realm, you must speak to all that you meet. However, you must kill all whom you meet. Rowland swallows hard. Kill? Long fingers tightened round Rowland's wrist. Yes, behead them. Then Merlin reaches up to the rafters of his hut and takes down a long, smoke-blackened sword. Here, he says in his wheedling rasp, this was your father's. He gave it to me and told me to give it to you. This is a sword that never strikes in vain. Rowland stands with the too big for him sword. Is this all? All? Merlin's eyebrows rise up high on his forehead. All, he says, all. Let me tell you, boy, the King of Elfland is a fearsome fellow to go against. He's bitter and hard. Suppose you win through to his Dark Tower, you will find him a cunning and merciless enemy. Rowland stands. A youthful and naive haughtiness flushes him. Is this all? Yes, go. Merlin rubs sage and thyme into his simmering pot. Just one more question. What? Are you making a spell in that pot? No, it's my dinner. On the brow of the hill of trees called Chanctonbury, Rowland shoulders the long blade and pauses. He turns back to look, but Merlin's hut is gone. Gone as if it has never been. Inland, from the South Downs, lies the Weald, which in Rowland's morning, all those years ago, is a belt of forest miles wide, miles deep. His chalk path leads down into the green, shuddering light. Small against the first trunks, Rowland soon passes among the tall oak tribe and is lost. He walks until his legs are sapped. He walks until the day begins to dim. He sleeps in a ferny hollow and wakes to shake off the leaves and the insects. He walks the forest alone, with only the litter of unseen birdsong in his ears. He sleeps and wakes again. Days pass in the forest. He walks until his shoes split open. He leaves the forest and skirts a great grey lake in the shadow of a high mountain. He climbs the mountain, leaning on the sword when the fatigue overcomes him. Weeks pass and still he tramps on. His chestnut hair grows long around his shoulders. He never looks behind in case his heart fails him. His eyes are forever narrowed to the way ahead. The wind whistles into his eyes. He walks until there comes a time when all he knows is that he must walk, and his sister is only a grudging memory in the deep of his mind. One day at sunset, he walks across a bare, gravelly field and finds a place to sleep on the banks of a stream that flows away into a cleft between the rocks. He awakes to a dim dawn and rouses himself as he'd done 100 times before. A cool wind blows the dock leaves away from him as he begins his journey, and the half-light seems to prickle his skin. He walks for an hour, but the pearly morning grows no brighter. There is no low sun in the sky, but far to the north a handful of pale stars glimmer. Rowland looks about himself and notices how darkly green and luscious the foliage has become. How slow the breeze feels on his face, and he begins to realise and he must have passed into Elfland. He walks through a sweep of buttercups and up into a cleared pasture. Horses graze there. Horses the like of which Rowland has never seen before. Beautiful white creatures with red manes and silver hooves. They have necks like swans, like tipping spouts of milk as they bend to the deep emerald grass. In the midst of the horses stands a herdsman with a clutch of halters in his hands. "Here, sir," says Rowland breathlessly, "I have come to find the King of Elfland." He's relieved at last, after so many weeks on the road alone to meet someone. The herdsman faces him. There is a steady champ as the horses pitch and dip. The stranger is clothed in rags, the colour of new nettles. His face is dark under his hood, but his eyes glitter like sixpences in a well. He says nothing, but he holds out his hand, and a red shiny apple sits in the palm. "No, thank you, sir." Rowland's shrunken stomach yearns for the apple. "Where is your king's dark tower?" The herdsman turns away, and in a voice as bleak as grey sleet, he says, "I don't know." Rowland looks across the pasture and sees a gap in the spinney where his path leads. He goes to walk on, but stops when he remembers the sword on his shoulder, his father's sword, the sword that never fails. The herdsman is standing there with his green back to him. Rowland grunts, but the blade whispers, and in a blink, a breath, a twitch, the stranger's head rolls into the grass. Beyond the spinney is a hedge with a heavy gate. Rowland swings the gate and enters a field where the wet clover reaches his thighs. Cows of the like he has never seen before raise their heads. They are great tall beasts with splashes of red across their white flanks like bloody banners. Their ears twitch redly, and their wide horns are silver. When they start lowing, the clover spills from their slack mouths. A cowherd in a green cloak, hardly older than Rowland himself, steps through the cattle. He smiles broadly and swishes the grass with his stick. His hair is as red as embers, and his eyes glitter silver, like great salmon scales. He says nothing, but offers a piece of yellow cheese to the famished traveller. Rowland declines, although for an instant his hand half reaches for the food. "Where is the king's dark tower?" he asks the smiling boy. A troubled change, like a melting candle, passes across the face of the cowherd. He turns away, and in a voice as sour as spoilt milk, he says, "I don't know." The blade never fails. A whistle in the morning, a slick polishing arc, a scything tear underneath the wind, and the cowherd's head leaps from his body. Rowland walks on. By a bank of bluebells, a cottage of rough slabbed daub stands with a crazy chimney. Next to the hovel is a yard where chickens pick. Rowland has never seen fowl such as these. The cockerel's comb is silver. His spurs glint like red thorns. Boldly white is this little emperor's plumage. Around him, his crimson hens scratch with beaks like silver clasps. A henwife in a tattered green bonnet is tending the chickens. She casts yellow vetch flowers and seeds across the yard. She is as twisted as an old yew, and as she looks up at Rowland, her eyes glitter silver like new cobbler's tacks. She smiles toothlessly and reaches into her patched coat. She holds out an egg, newly boiled and peeled. Rowland's hunger cries in his belly, in his legs, and his mouth, but he shakes his head. He places the tip of his sword into the gravel at his feet and coughs. "I'm seeking the King of Elfland and his dark tower. Can you give me the direction?" The henwife's face seems to crumple inwards, like an old leather bucket, but she nods and raises her arm. Her hand is like a clump of fresh dug burdock root. She points a crooked finger and says, "That way." Her voice is dry dry as an ungreased hinge, as though she hasn't spoken for a long, long time. Rowland draws a small circle in the gravel with the point of his blade. How far? Not far. How do I enter the dark tower? The henwife shifts from one leg to the other. She groans, "You must say 3 times, 'Open door.'" Then she turns her back to him and pulls the green bonnet over her face. Rowland sees that she has dropped the seeds and yellow vetch flowers, as if she knows what's coming. Sweep, snick, sheer, keen as ice water bites the blade that never fails. Rowland leaves the henwife's head rolling towards a bowl where the chickens drink. So Rowland follows the slant of the old woman's direction, and this leads him across some scrubby hills where oxeye daisies nod at him in the thick air. At last he comes to a stone wall, and over it he sees a narrow valley just like the one he left in Sussex all those weeks ago. Just like? No. Instead of a Saxon chapel, in its place stands a green mound, grown all over with knotted brambles. The light, such as it is, has grown murky, so the mound looks as if it is choked below stagnant pond water. When he comes to stand before it, he marvels that it's only twice his height. He walks around it and quickly arrives back at the place of his own beginning. So is this the dark tower? He looks for a door, but all is wet grass and nodding brambles. Chestnut-haired like a colt and made small against the weight of his father's sword, Rowland takes a deep breath and shouts wildly, "Open door! Open door! Open door!" The mound shudders. Clods of grass tumble from the mound. There is a grinding clamour below Rowland's feet, and the centre of his vision is suddenly blurred. A cold wind comes, a shrieking wind that plays his ears badly. Soil and stones spatter his face, his arms, his chest. He throws down his father's swords and stands before the rending earth, rubbing his eyes and muffling his ears. When the wind tails away, Rowland rubs the flung dirt from his face and looks up. Above and through and in the mound, but not of it, has risen a glassy black tower, yet tiny, as if seen from a great distance. It stands for an instant, arches, buttresses, and turrets, all picked in sharp lustre. Then it fades, and Rowland sees that the mound is open. A stone lintel, all spiral carved, frames a black passage into the ground. When the boy crosses the threshold, he is stung by a chill, catching his neck, and a gust that passes over him like a sigh. Darkness. Now he walks blind. The polished floor slopes downwards, as slick as a frozen stream. He touches the close walls, and his fingers graze etched lines that flow forward, ever forward. He treads unlit, eyes gaping on the dark like passing into a fearful sleep. He has walked for weeks to find the door into the dark tower, but now he walks until he forgets he is walking. He forgets his eyes. He forgets his own name. The memory candles of his sister and 2 brothers have guttered out. He still holds the sword that never fails, his father's sword, but he's forgotten it. He wades the darkness, and for all he knows, years could be sweeping by him. He walks. Until, at the end of the black, down in the very deep, after his timeless pacing, Rowland's sword scrapes against a door. He trips and falls against it. The door swings open and he staggers, shivering and wordless, into the hall of the Elf King. The vault of the roof rears in the gloom. The floor, like the sheet of a black lake, skates away from him to a throne between 2 pillars of stone. And his sister Bird Ellen is seated there. His sister who was forgotten on his long trek downwards. Her name breaks from his lips. He runs to her across the fathoms of the shining floor. When Bird Ellen sees him, she stands and steps down from her dais. She wears a velvet gown, the colour of mulberries, such a garment as she could never have hoped to wear in the mortal world. At her throat is a silver pendant. It flashes as she rises. He draws near and sees not joy, but a pinch of pain in her face, as if she's snared in a burl of thorns. You should not have come. Her voice is lower than the voice he knew. There are tears in it. I've come to save you. He reaches his fingers towards her, but she shakes her head. Brother, this cannot be. Ellen retreats to the dais. You must go back before the king finds you here. But I've come so far. I cannot go back without you. You must. The pale look of pain seems to be growing on her face. Rowland feels his legs giddying, and he finds that his head has become as light as a kindled leaf. Thirsty. He realises that he's not drunk a drop since he entered Elfland. Water. His voice is dry as ashes. Ellen looks at him with her tear-heavy gaze, and she turns to a silver ewer. She pours water and hands him a wide earthen cup. He takes it and looks down into the water, and his face billows there, haggard and famished. Cold water, like the spring near Coombs, where the water will numb your teeth and slice any thirst. His sister waits as Rowland raises the bowl. Spring water, like the icy cry of a hawk on the downs above Coombs. Spring water like a spear of memory. Spring water. Merlin's words. Ellen screams as Rowland dashes the cup to the floor, and it jumps into many shards. Go, she begs. I'm held here by the spell of the king, but you must go. Before Rowland can reply, at the far end of the hall, a door flies clean off its hinges, and in bursts the king. Fast he is, like a long black hound. He leaps across the floor, and his eyes glitter like shattered flint, like beetle shell, like ink on a silver nib. He cries at Rowland in a strange language, all upside down and backstrung. And then he's upon him. When the Elf King strikes, Rowland is tossed in the air like an empty jacket. He lands in a clump, and his father's sword, the blade that never fails, skitters away across the polished floor. The king rages at him again. White face like a youth, old eyes and black curls. Such fury as he works his red mouth. A backhanded swipe, and Rowland is flung to the steps of the dais. The Elf King stands over him. His armour is as black as a swallowing moonless night. His tingling, piercing, unintelligible words glance every shining surface, but there are no echoes in his dark tower. He raises his right hand, and a flock of silver darts rain from the unseen roof. He spreads his left hand, and the throne frets into a million splinters. Rowland thrashes. His clothes are shredded. He is slashed and pierced. The king bends. His left fist is drawn back, clenched for the killing blow. His shadow spiders across the youngster. Triumph kindles darkly in his ancient eyes. But Rowland swims his arm across the fathomless floor, and his fingers reach for the pommel of the sword, his father's sword, the sword that never fails. Hiss breathes the blade, a wintry curse, a tang of iron, and now Rowland is up, and the long nip of the sword is at the white throat of the Elf King, and he quails, for he cannot abide forged chimed steel. Down he is forced onto his knees, bleeding and bruised. Rowland holds the king fast at one glistening shoulder, for he has found a steady Sussex courage in himself, and he sees how his enemy frets under the blade, sorry. I'm getting carried away with myself. Yield, he cries, for he remembers how the Sussex men say, we won't be druv. A smudge of agony passes over the face of the Elf King, and an uncertain look, like an infant roughly woken. He glances to the right and to the left of him. Free my sister, free my two brothers, commands Rowland. The king's white face is that of a tormented child. He wails in anguish, old wild words, syllables coughed from deep black corners. To Rowland they are tongue thorns, spite lashes, vex-hatched grudges. Yet at last he submits, trembling with his black eyes on the long sword, the blade that never fails. He opens his mailed fist and stars his fingers. He whispers a quick tracery of sibilance, and in an instant he grows dim against the sheen of the floor, and then he's gone. Rowland's sword that pricked against elf flesh now ponders on nothing. All that is left is a flurry of white hawthorn petals floating on the polished onyx floor. Heaving and shaking, Rowland looks to his sister, Ellen, who steps on the dais in her mulberry gown with tears like pearls on her cheeks. As she walks between the two stone pillars, they smoke into the forms of the brothers, Alfred and Ham. At the far end of the hall, a door is ajar. Child Rowland drops the blade that never fails, and it clangs like a mass bell. The four of them walk outside to a sunlit morning. An oaky slam, a sound fettered with bands of wielding iron, makes them turn. They see, to their astonishment, that they have just stepped from the door of the church at Coombs. How can it be that the king of Elfland's dark tower stood unnoticed and masked in the Saxon-napped flints of the church? Child Rowland creaks open the latch and pokes his chestnut head into the familiar nave. He sees the murals, the font, the rood screen. The Bible lays shut and clasped. Before they step through the tapsel gate, they run the small circuit of the church, letting the wind wash the fug of the under place of Elfland from their limbs. Their laughter is sieved through yew and elm branches and then into the naked downland air. Bird Ellen runs ahead of her brothers, and as she comes back to the porch, her mulberry gown fades to original brown. The astonishment of their deliverance passes from them quickly, and they are untroubled by the time they step through the tapsel gate, all except Bird Ellen. For as the last patch of mulberry scarlet blotches across her breast, she looks for an instant as if she's struggling to recall a lost dream. What is certain is that none of them will ever run widdershins around the church again. One last thing. The next morning, the verger is most truly perplexed to find a sword, twisted, strained, and mangled, flung into the graveyard among a scatter of white hawthorn petals. Shall I do some more speaking now?
Why not? Yes. And I'm sure Steve will be very happy to take some questions, but maybe about the development of the story. So
well, it's I wanted to kind of own this story, and Coombs Church, if any of you know it, it's an amazing place, almost forgotten church, it struck me that it would be good to place it there, and that kind of almost kind of ritual landscape of Cissbury and Chanctonbury and Coombs seems to have some kind of kind of special atmosphere to it, and I wanted to locate it there, and it's part of that idea of trying to kind of take possession of the story and to tell it, I think for me to kind of have it into the fabric of somewhere near where I've lived for a while is kind of was important. It's the, for me, I don't know why I keep taking and putting on my glasses. For me, the sense of the unknowableness of the other, the creatures, is fascinating, and the kind of why did the King of Elfland nick them? You know, you can understand Bird Ellen, maybe you can understand that, but why the brothers? Why did he keep them? Why, you know, the kind of what does he do? That kind of absolute unknowableness of these creatures from somewhere else. That's kind of that gnomic, quizzical, riddling aspect of it. Then also, the sense of kind of the morality of the piece is odd. And it's odd in all of the stories, because in a way, I don't know if you know the story of Child Rowland, or if this is the first time, but you kind of think, well, he's a kind of murderer. Well, is he a murderer? But he could just kill. And who are these creatures he's killed? And what if he ignored them? What if he hadn't killed them? What kind of weird, as in the WYRD, what kind of weird is he operating under? What does he why does he have to do that? There are so many kind of unanswered questions here, which is I kind of find fascinating. And so when I came to as a poet and writing these stories from a kind of using my kind of poetic grounding, I wanted also to make it kind of live in the senses. And I don't know if it works, but the kind of idea of each sentence must have something that appeals to the senses is what I tell my students about all the time. And don't care really what I read about with my students at Portsmouth, but please just try and make it live. And that's what I've tried to do. But essentially, beyond all that is that thing that I keep coming back to, like a piece of elastic, is the liminality of the crossing over, of crossing over again, and then crossing back. I find it wonderful, but also quite disturbing, really. Alice.
Steve, thanks so much for that. I found that just compelling and strange, and I love, above all, the language of it. And I was thinking that so this is part comment and part question, but I was thinking, as a writer, approaching this sort of tale that has a life of its own already, and that question of how you do make it your own. It seemed to me as I listened, I thought, gosh, it's just so brilliantly physical. So I guess that's what you're saying about the senses. It was so freshly physicalized. So that seemed to me one aspect. I was trying to think how I would approach it, and I thought, yes, that's the only way, is to make all the physicality of it vivid and fresh all over again. But also, I did love the dynamic. I mean, it's so richly metaphorical, your piece. And maybe that's the line, I can think still of his eyes like winter, her voice like an ungreased hinge, the shuddering light, the horses' necks like tipping spouts of milk, which I thought was just exquisite. And I wonder if you can say a little bit, this is the question part, about how because I am quite fascinated by metaphor and its dynamic, and I'm wondering why that, because at some level clearly that was important for you, that metaphorical richness. And I'm just wondering how that might have also been part of you possessing the tale, or meeting something, matching something within the tale.
Yes,
I don't know.
definitely. No, the idea of so that it's a quite a simple template. The story really.
Yeah.
It's a kind of it really is the Meccano, and it's where how you fill in with things around it. But going back to the great say for instance the Mabinogion, or the Tanboy Cooley, looking at those kind of, there's lots of repetition, lots of glittering kind of metaphorical leap,
Right.
and I wanted to kind of try and achieve that. Whereas that that kind of savouring of the savouring of the sentence, or the expression, the metaphor is as precious as the story itself.
It is, and it absolutely is. And what you just said, that phrase, the metaphorical leap, it seems to me in some way that metaphor in the leap it makes and the sort of flux of it to and fro, it really sort of connects in some way to the liminality of the to and fro between. There's a leaping flux action. That's true at the baseline in metaphor, but also true at the more macroscopic level of the major elements. Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful to listen to.
The poem I've always loved is Child Rowland to the Dark Tower Came by Browning, and I was really struck by the fact that in your story there was, as Alison's just said so well, this incredible brightness and lightness, and I literally felt like I was watching a film. I could see it all so clearly. And
You're spoiling me now.
But what I was going to say is it was very different tone to Browning's poem, which is like a horrible psychosis, isn't it, that you go through. It's a fascinating poem about going through a kind of war-torn, lunatic sort of landscape, really. When you were taught, I mean, nothing could be more different in a way. But were you influenced at all by that? Or
So I was doing a lecture yesterday on the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I was explaining to my MA students about this kind of, maybe this again, that word, the wellspring. This is one of the primal stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's to do with Vogler's kind of, there are this limited amount of stories that you can tell. But in the sense of I gathered together as many versions of Child Rowland as I could, and tried to imbibe them, so trying to kind of feast on them really, and then there's this kind of idea: how do you make it your own? As Louis Spence does on X Factor, this kind of how do you make it your own? What do you do? But the sense of, I agree with you. There is a kind of there's a gloom and glower in his version, isn't there?
Oh, very much. Yeah.
But
I mean, Lucy's fairy tale almost goes into somewhere.
Yes.
Existential.
Yeah,
dark
existential,
existential.
yeah. And at the end, you don't know where he's got to either.
No.
You have the fee, fi, fo, fum.
Yes.
Yeah. But yours was so different in that way. The other thing I found quite disturbing, and you mentioned that straight away, was the thing about the heads coming off. It's such a decapitation, is such a sort of strange theme.
Especially nowadays, actually.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
It's very interesting that.
I've lived with this story for years. you may remember I wrote a musical
Oh,
piece
that's
for
right, of course,
Child
yeah.
Rowland. And the heads coming off in that version, they rise up again as three transformed noble companions.
Fantastic. Yes.
And the cowherd becomes a servant cowie, and the henwife, and in fact, in the version that I know, which is a Scottish version,
Yes.
or one of the versions that I used, called Rangates, which is the Scottish Widdershins. The horse herd is transformed into Roland's father at the very end of the story, and that's another strange twist. But the thing about the heads coming off, I remember when we did a performance for school children, just across the way there, on this campus, they all burst into tears at that point, and then heaved a sigh of relief when they rose up again. It was really strange. But I always thought of that as you lose your head to find your heart. You lose the conscious part to make connection with the with heart and with instinct.
I think, and beheading games, or beheading rituals, sorry, are deeply woven into Celtic mythology, aren't they? The beheading kind of the cult, maybe, and of course, you have is it Tacitus writing about the Celts beheading their enemies, and I kind of wonder, if there's something about that there. But you're telling it to children. A friend of mine, the artist who's going to paint these, he read it to his children. I said to Joe, don't read this to your children. This is really just terrifying. This is kind of, again, this is one of the things I want to kind of turn the clock back a bit and step back before the kind of brutification. But I mean, I'm glad the children were frightened when you're in your case, because you would want them to be, wouldn't you?
Jordan's version that happens.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Do you think, you mentioned morality earlier, do you think morality is an essential part of all fairy tales, or do you think it's something that's been added since sort of the Disneyfication of fairy tales?
I think there is a sense of each, and especially kind of Victoriana trying to add some kind of semblance morality to it. But yeah, there are if fairy stories and folktales are diminished kind of sense of epics and myths, and if you look back at them, there is kind of very different morality and very different kind of rules governing what people do, and they don't stand up. I always say I'm trying to sort of pick the wings off Tinkerbell, really. Kind of is that kind of Disneyfication is awful. Sit down yet?
What's it been like working with the painter?
Yeah, well, it's really good. He's what's called the Stuckists, and there's a Stuckist art movement. Yeah, and his name's his name's Joe Machine, which is not his real name, obviously. Mr. Machine. But he's very kind. He's just done a big series of Russian folktales and Russian fairy tales, and that did very well. So although I know him, then he sort of approached me and said, "Can I paint all of your stories? We'll do a big book this time, a big coffee table book." Who am I to say no? Who was I to say no? And these sell for thousands, these paintings. So I just hope he'll give me one, and then I can sell that. So that'd be good. But yes, it's been interesting. And the other thing was, I saw him on Monday, and I was talking to him about the time. There's a story that I was out with my father, and I was telling, my father's got dementia now, and I was out with my father years and years ago, and I was sitting the other day with my brother and my father, and I was saying, do you remember that time that I saw that white stag with you in the forest? And it was amazing, wasn't it? And my father, with a brief moment of clarity, said, it wasn't you. And I said to him, yes, it was. He said, no, it wasn't you, it was you and Warren, as my brother. And my brother said, no, you weren't there. And I said, but I remember it. I remember it. He said, no, but you weren't there. We know you weren't there. And I kind of thought, well, was I or wasn't I? I don't know now. But I told it to this Joe Machine, this artist, and he said, oh, brilliant, I'm going to paint that one as well. So that's kind of, God knows what that's going to look like, the kind of false memory of a white stag. So it's been good. It's quite good.
How are you selecting? Sorry. just assume knows we know. How are you selecting which stories to go in? Yeah.
Well, there's some have just fallen by the wayside, and of course it's as big, isn't it? It could go on forever. That was the problem with the kind of open-ended, no deadline, because you just go on and on and on forever. And so I've got about 35, 36 now, and I've just winnow it down to about 25, I think. And there are some that just fall, they just don't feel right at the moment. Yeah, plenty for later. Yeah.
Steve, could you say a little bit about, obviously your connection to Sussex is very strong and it comes through very, very well in that story. I wonder if you did much work with sort of Sussex folktale and myth and lore, and whether that found its way into the story as well.
Yes, and I know Jacqueline Simpson, quite well, and she's here. I was at the symposium and she was here, and she lives in Worthing, and so kind of been immersed in that, and it's. I think Sussex was unusual in that the roads came late to Sussex, so it's hard to imagine now that Sussex was a kind of a backwater in the 19th century, and then it became kind of firmly plugged in with the railways and the roads, and so things were preserved. So, for instance, I was only reading the other day about the Mummers plays, the Tit-Tirers, were really, there were kind of elements of that were preserved in Sussex, were lost in other parts of the country. And again, they've got an amazing thing of resurrection and death and bringing back to life. And so Sussex has got some significance if you scratch into it. And also a passion of mine has always been Belloc, Hilaire Belloc, who kind of wrote quite long and broadly about Sussex, and a deep appreciation of place and kind of the kind of sense of the stories that kind of hang around every corner and every crossroads and every hollow. And I'm not too happy with the fairies of Sussex. Because I don't know, many of you probably know that the fairies in Sussex came to be called Pharisees. And it's because of the Sussex accent and dialect, fairies is. And so eventually they got confused with Pharisees. And so people would, in the kind of early 19th century would tell stories about seeing Pharisees around the place. And they completely confused the thing. So they don't really, I much prefer the kind of the Celtic kind of, the kind of shining, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Dana. And then there's much nicer, because the fairies have always been diminished over the years in Sussex to these kind of squeaky little Pharisee creatures. Interesting, I don't know if many of you know about the Nucker and the Nikor. It's wonderful. I mean, those very occasionally, because lots of folklorists like to claim kind of long lineages, like the heading may be ancient. But as many of you maybe know, the Nucker, the stories of the Nucker, the dragon in the Nucker hole, various places around Arundel, around there was kind of Nikor means water horse in Old Saxon, and that took some kind of linguist to realise that. All the while they preserved this kind of very old story of the kind of strange water horse dragon creature. So yes, Sussex is a kind of a pretty verdant place. Yeah. Peter, how are you? How are you? Anyway, good to see you.
Good to see
you. And John.
Mine's very quick, really. So you're going to leave some out. Is any of this finding its way into poems as well?
Yeah. And you know how the trouble with these stories is because they're so widely circulated and known. I just finished a poem called The Hawk Bride, and I look at Kate's Moss book, which is all, and then also a friend of mine who's an artist in Lewis has been painting a series of kind of this, and you think, this is like Jungian kind of, but yes, of course. Yeah.
Hi Steve, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
I love the rich theatricality of that and of your writing. I was just reflecting really, and it's not really a question, it's more of a thought about the great Bruno Bettelheim and uses of enchantment, the great Freudian reading and interpretation of folk tales as metaphors of growth. And I think, from a kind of broadly Freudian point of view, the whole, the dismemberment, the beheading, is very much a kind of, is arguably readable as a kind of castration fear and castration anxiety. It just got me thinking about whether or not our Harold is needs to kill the symbolic father and can only really be released, as can his brethren when he does.
Because someone said to me, I was reading it in London recently, and someone said, are those three creatures, are they all the Elf King in disguised? Yeah. And is he the father? This kind of the father kind of figure, yeah. I don't know. Don't care. Alison.
I'm just wondering, Stephen, if you could just say a little bit, for for new writers in the room about your development, into over the years, how you started to write, how you've come to write something as wonderful as that, and just wondering just your path as a writer, really, onto editing.
Well, I mean, my degree was here, and John remembers. I haven't seen you for ages. We haven't seen each other for ages. I was walking.
The secret is safe.
Yeah, great to yes, great alumni, two alumni from the year of the 1990, was it? I'm not sure. Anyway,
I started here.
yeah. Well, we left just before you came along, I think.
Did
Yeah.
you?
So we were. There was a great course called Literature as Expressive Arts, which is run by John Saunders, and we were able to write and imaginatively, creatively, and that's kind of where it started, I think, for me. Obviously, I was singing a lot before then, but really the kind of sense of the writing was kind of the permission to write was given here. And so it's wonderful to come
you were
back.
with Vicky, weren't you? Particularly with
Vicky
Vicky
Fever, yes.
Who's reading on the MA?
Oh yes, on March 18th.
Yes,
Vicky
Vicky's
Fever
here that
is coming
evening.
back.
Do
I've read
remember
that,
seeing
so.
that.
But then I wrote lots of poems and primarily saw myself as a poet, and kind of was publishing in poetry magazines. Then I did some editing of a kind of assistant editing of a journal called Agenda, which is still going under Patricia McCarthy, and then I got the strange request whether I'd be prepared to take on the editorship of the London magazine, which is kind of the oldest journal of the literature and the arts, and of course you can't turn those kind of things down. And so I kind of would then kind of became in that role kind of this trying to assemble writing every other month and trying to draw it together of fiction, short fiction, and poetry, and reviews and essays, and trying to kind of create this assembly, living assembly of this thing that started in 1732. And so that's been quite good. That's the last 4 years. But then also the writing thread through, as you well know, I mean, because Alison's, she's been kind of involved in the London magazine. In fact, you're a patron of us, aren't you?
I'm something like that.
You are a
I
patron.
can't remember what you called me, but
Yes,
I'll take patron.
Yes.
Thank
We
you.
will bow when you come to the room. Yes. So and then of course I'm also an academic in creative writing at Portsmouth, and so I kind of play the hokey cokey in all of those different spheres, jumping in and out of writing and editing and teaching writing.
Thank you, Steve.
Can I sit down now?
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got time for a couple more questions, if from the floor. Yeah.
Tim, I might have a quick question on setting and location.
Yes.
I love the setting because it's a landscape that's really familiar to me. I live very close to Chantonbury Ring, and I don't know where this Coombs Church is.
Well, it's just over. You know where the cement factory is in Shoreham, the big old redundant cement works.
Right, yeah.
If you were standing at the cement works and looking across the Ada, you would go up and you would see some buildings, and a kind of above and beyond a little bit is Coombs Church. There's some amazing frescoes, really old frescoes, beautiful, and it's a tiny little place. And my brother wanted to get married there, but they wouldn't allow him to get married there. It's only open very, very rarely.
Yes, I think I do know exactly where that is. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone told me that it was a plague village anyway, and that there was.
It's always been shut up.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not used. Yeah, I know.
And the village was bigger, and then the plague came, and it was kind of diminished, and there's only a few buildings there now.
It's really ancient.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's still got original Saxon murals.
Yes.
Yes, you said that.
How does time work in this particular tale?
I'm not sure. It's kind of
It's has a lot of time passed, or
I'm not sure. In that kind of Narnia way of stepping back out again, I would imagine it. Not time hasn't passed. You know, those old stories, aren't they? Where you'd be walking past the hill, and the kind of fairies would invite you in to their big party, and then you'd kind of sometimes you'd wake up, you come out 100 years later, or sometimes they give you loads of gold if they felt like it. Other time they might replace your eyes with marbles. You know, it's kind of how they feel on the day. Yeah, and time. I don't think. Yeah, it's kind of.
Just one other quick one, and like Alison, I was always swooning some of the imagery in your telling. But I also had this constant conflation going on in my head, because I'm very interested in Cuthman and his journey. And when you then mentioned Chanctonbury and that whole, all those valleys, and I was thinking particularly of Christopher Fry's poetry in the play about Cuthman. And I'm wondering whether you conflated that in any way. It's a very different kind of story.
No, definitely. And I read, you're actually right, because I read Belloc's version of his kind of potted version of Cuthman's story. And you're definitely, and kind of Merlin's a bit in there as well, you know, the kind of sense of Merlin as this, and slightly undefinable character, really. Definitely,
the way that Christopher Fry describes the landscape, there were hints of that in your poetic telling as well.
No, yes, definitely.
Any final points? No? Okay, well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Steve for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And such a wonderful reading. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.